On the morning of July 9th, 1755, a 60-year-old British general rode at the head of 1,400 men in scarlet coats, colors flying, drums beating, bayonets fixed. He marched in full-dress uniform through a corridor of forest 12 feet wide, deep in the Pennsylvania wilderness, 8 miles from a French fort he intended to reduce by sunset. By late afternoon, 977 of those men lay dead or wounded along a single mile of road. The general himself was on the forest floor with a shattered arm and a musket ball through his lung. The enemy that did this to him, French colonial troops, Canadian militia, and native warriors from the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley, had lost 23 killed and 20 wounded. Let those numbers sit for a moment. 1,459 British troops engaged, 977 casualties. A 67% loss rate inflicted by an enemy force roughly 2/3 their size, in an engagement neither side had planned. This was not a siege. This was not a pitched battle on chosen ground. This was a meeting engagement on a narrow forest road, and within 3 hours, it had become one of the most catastrophic defeats in the history of British arms. The man who ordered the march was Major General Edward Braddock, a career officer of the Coldstream Guards. He believed in linear formations, disciplined volleys, and the natural superiority of British regulars over any force the wilderness could produce. He believed in these things the way men believed in gravity. He would die believing them, and he would take most of his army with him. Empires do not fall in single afternoons, but sometimes they reveal, in 3 hours of forest fighting, exactly what is going to kill them. By the end of this video, you will understand how an 891-man force destroyed an army nearly twice its size on the banks of the Monongahela River. You will see why every advantage the British carried into that forest, discipline, artillery, professional training, 2 centuries of European military doctrine, became a liability the moment the first shot was fired. You will meet a young provincial colonel named George Washington, who rode through that slaughter with 4 musket balls through his coat and 2 horses shot from under him. And you will hear what a Delaware warrior named Redcoats said about him decades later. You will follow a captive Pennsylvania youth named James Smith into Fort Duquesne, where he watched from the battlements as 12 British soldiers were tortured to death on the banks of the Allegheny River the day after the battle. And you will discover why this defeat, largely forgotten now, overshadowed by the revolution that followed 20 years later, produced the officers who would dismantle the very empire that lost them in 1755. This is the story of what happens when an empire confuses its own arrogance for inevitability. Hit subscribe before we begin. Let us walk into the forest with Edward Braddock. To understand why 1,400 British soldiers were marching through western Pennsylvania in the summer of 1755, you have to understand what they were marching toward. Not the fort itself. The idea behind the fort. The vast, fertile, contested expanse of land that the British called the Ohio country and the French called the indispensable link of their North American empire. The Ohio River Valley sprawled across what is now Ohio, western Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Indiana. For the British, it represented the natural westward extension of their seaboard colonies. Virginia and Pennsylvania land speculators saw fortunes in those river valleys. Settlers saw farmland richer than anything on the coast. Traders saw networks of native communities ready to exchange furs for British-manufactured goods at prices the French could not match. For the French, the Ohio country was something more elemental. It was the spine that connected New France in Canada to the Louisiana territory along the Mississippi. Lose the Ohio, and the French Empire in North America split in half. Hold it, and the British colonies could be hemmed in along the Atlantic coast indefinitely, prevented from expanding into the continent's interior. The valley was not a luxury for France. It was an existential requirement. By the early 1750s, France acted on that requirement with the cold precision of an empire that understood what it was doing. French military engineers began constructing a chain of forts running south from Lake Erie toward the forks of the Ohio, the strategic point where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers joined to form the Ohio. Fort Presque Isle, Fort Le Boeuf, Fort Machaut, and finally, in April 1754, the keystone of the system, Fort Duquesne, built directly on the forks themselves, a triangular fortress of earth and timber that commanded the gateway to the entire Ohio drainage. The British understood what this meant. So did the native nations of the Ohio country, who watched two European empires move toward collision on their land and tried to position themselves to survive whatever came next. The first sparks came not from the forts, but from the trade networks. On June 21, 1752, an Ottawa war chief named Charles Michel Mouet de Langlade, Métis by birth, French by allegiance, raised in the borderlands where European and native worlds overlapped, assembled a war party of 240 Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi warriors. Their target was a Miami village and British trading post called Pickawillany in present-day western Ohio. The Miami chief there, a man known as Memeskia, or Old Britain, for his pro-English politics, had been at the center of British efforts to draw Ohio Valley tribes into their commercial orbit. Langlade's warriors overran the post. They captured Memeskia, and then, in a ritualized display witnessed by surviving British traders and by the chief's own family, they killed him, boiled his body, and ate it. A wounded British captive was killed alongside him. The message was not subtle. The Ohio trade networks belonged to France, and any native leader who chose otherwise would not survive the choice. The raid triggered a cascade. British colonial governors demanded action. Native communities reassessed their alliances. And in Williamsburg, Virginia, Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie decided that someone had to ride into the Ohio country and tell the French to leave. The man he chose was 21 years old. George Washington in 1753 was nothing like the figure history would later assemble. He was tall, ambitious, undereducated, and desperate for the kind of military reputation his half-brother Lawrence had earned in the Caribbean. Dinwiddie sent him north as a messenger with a formal demand that French forces withdraw from territory Virginia claimed. The French commander received the message politely, fed Washington, and refused. A year later, Washington came back at the head of a small Virginia militia force, this time with orders to assert British presence by force, if necessary. On May 28, 1754, in a forest clearing in what is now western Pennsylvania, Washington and his men ambushed a French scouting party. The fight lasted 15 minutes. The French officer in command, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, was killed, either in the firefight itself or, according to the French version, killed in cold blood by Washington's native ally, the Mingo leader Tanagrisson, after surrendering. What happened in that clearing matters because the French treated it as murder. Jumonville, they argued, had been on a diplomatic mission. Washington had killed an envoy. The French response was swift. A larger force, including Jumonville's own brother, marched against Washington's hastily constructed fortification. A circular wooden palisade Washington had named Fort Necessity, in a meadow surrounded by higher wooded ground that made it nearly impossible to defend. On July 3, 1754, in driving rain that soaked the British powder and rendered their muskets useless, the French surrounded Fort Necessity and poured fire into it from the surrounding tree line. Washington's men took casualties they could not return. By evening, he was negotiating surrender. He signed articles of capitulation written in French, a language he could not read, that explicitly acknowledged the assassination of Jumonville. He marched his surviving men out of the fort the next day and back toward Virginia, having handed the French a propaganda victory that would echo across 2 continents. The Virginia colonel had lost his first command. He had surrendered on the anniversary of what would, 22 years later, become his country's Independence Day. He had been outmaneuvered in the wilderness by an enemy that understood the terrain better than he did. And he had, almost certainly, started a world war. Because the news of Fort Necessity reached London, and London reacted not with diplomacy, but with iron. If the French wanted to fight for the Ohio country, the British government would oblige them. The Duke of Cumberland, favorite son of King George II, hero of Culloden, the man who had crushed the Jacobite rising less than a decade earlier, would oversee a comprehensive military response. Not just a punitive expedition, a coordinated 4-pronged campaign across the entire North American frontier, aimed at breaking French power from Nova Scotia to the Mississippi. The primary blow would fall on Fort Duquesne, and to deliver it, Cumberland selected a general he knew personally, trusted absolutely, and considered the embodiment of everything the British Army stood for. The general's name was Edward Braddock. He was 60 years old. He had never commanded troops in combat. Edward Braddock was born in London in January 1695, the son of a Major General of the same name. The British Army was not something he chose. It was something he inherited. His father purchased him an ensign's commission in the Coldstream Guards at the age of 15. And from that moment until the day he died on a forest road in Pennsylvania, Braddock knew no other world. He rose through the ranks the way men of his class rose. Slowly, through purchase and patronage, through garrison duty in places that never quite became battlefields. He spent decades in administrative posts and in the elaborate ceremonial choreography of regiments stationed where the actual fighting happened to other people. He acquired a reputation. Edward Braddock was rigid, formal, devoted to the precise observation of military protocol, and absolutely intolerant of any deviation from established procedure. He believed armies functioned because men obeyed orders, and men obeyed orders because the system of discipline was inviolable. He was also, by every contemporary account, personally arrogant. On May 26, 1718, a young Braddock fought a duel in Hyde Park with a British colonel named Waller over a matter of honor whose specifics history has not preserved. He survived. The duel established something about him that would never change. Edward Braddock would not be slighted, would not be argued with, would not allow his judgment to be questioned by inferiors. When the Duke of Cumberland chose him for the Ohio Command in 1754, Braddock had spent 45 years in uniform without ever leading men against an enemy. He had never seen a musket fired in anger by anyone trying to kill him. He was, by training and temperament, the perfect product of the 18th century British military system, and almost perfectly unsuited for the war he was about to fight. He arrived in Virginia in February 1755, aboard the warship Centurion. He was 60 years old, gout-ridden, accustomed to the orderly bureaucracy of British garrison life. He landed in a colony that, by his standards, barely functioned at all. The colonial administration he encountered was a tangle of competing assemblies, jealous governors, and parsimonious legislatures, all of whom were perfectly willing to support the king's war effort so long as someone else paid for it. Braddock had been promised wagons, draft animals, supplies, money, and provincial troops. He found that most of these promises existed only on paper. The Virginia Assembly was reluctant to fund operations benefiting land speculators rather than ordinary taxpayers. The Pennsylvania Assembly, dominated by Quaker pacifists, was constitutionally opposed to military expenditure on principle. Braddock's contempt for the colonists was immediate and total. He found them lazy, mercenary, undisciplined, and arrogantly insistent on consultation in matters he considered his exclusive military prerogative. He met with colonial governors at the Alexandria Congress in April 1755 and emerged convinced that nothing in America could be relied upon except the regiments he had brought from Ireland. Those regiments were the 44th and 48th Regiments of Foot. They were not elite formations. They had been on garrison duty in Ireland for years, peacetime postings that left units chronically understrength. To bring them up to combat strength, Braddock authorized aggressive recruiting drives across the colonies. The recruits were a cross-section of colonial America's underclass. In Fairfax County, Sheriff Daniel McCarty enlisted 200 men for Colonel Peter Halkett's 44th Regiment, drawing primarily from impoverished tenant farmers, former convicts, and men who had run out of other options. The imperial physical standards were exact. Recruits had to be Protestant, at least 16 years old, broad-shouldered, and at least 5 feet 5 inches tall. The standards filtered the recruiting pool but did nothing about what was inside the men's heads. Many had never fired a musket. None had ever fought in a forest. To these regulars, Braddock added provincial companies from Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas. He regarded them with open contempt. Provincial troops, in his view, were armed civilians playing at war, useful only for menial tasks, cutting roads, hauling supplies, guarding wagons. He refused to mix them with his regulars in combat formations. He refused to commission their officers at ranks equivalent to their British counterparts. This last decision had specific consequences. George Washington, who had been a provincial colonel at Fort Necessity, found that under Braddock's arrangements he would be reduced to captain, the highest provincial rank Braddock would recognize. Washington declined to serve under those terms. Then, in a maneuver that suggested he understood the political realities better than the formal ones, he accepted a position as volunteer aide-de-camp on Braddock's personal staff. Unpaid, unranked, but present. Close enough to learn. Close enough, as it turned out, to survive. Accompanying the column were approximately 50 camp followers, laundresses, cooks, seamstresses, nurses, and wives. They were essential to the Army's functioning. Among them was Charlotte Brown, matron of the General Hospital at Fort Cumberland, who kept a journal that survives today as one of the few first-hand accounts of the expedition from a woman's perspective. She would watch the Army march out. She would watch much smaller remnants of it return. By late May 1755, Braddock had assembled at Fort Cumberland a force of approximately 2,200 men, 2 regiments of regulars, provincial companies, a train of heavy brass siege artillery, Coehorn mortars, and approximately 200 supply wagons. It was the largest single military force the British had ever assembled in North America. Braddock looked at this force and saw what he had been trained to see. A professional army equipped to reduce a frontier fort according to the established principles of European siegecraft. He would march to Fort Duquesne. He would invest the position. He would bring his guns into battery. He would breach the walls. He would accept the French surrender. He did not see what was actually in front of him. 2,200 men about to march into a wilderness they did not understand, against an enemy they could not see, along a road they would have to build themselves through some of the most rugged terrain in eastern North America. He did not see the native warriors whose forest tactics had evolved over centuries of intertribal warfare, refined into a system that European armies had no doctrine to counter. He did not see because he did not know how to see. He had spent 45 years in uniform, learning a way of war that had no provision for the forest he was about to enter. On May 29, 1755, the drums beat for the general at 3 o'clock in the morning. The wagoners harnessed their horses under threat of physical punishment for delay. The 44th and 48th Regiments of Foot formed in their companies. The provincial troops fell in behind them, and Edward Braddock, 60 years old, gout-ridden, certain in every fiber of his being that he commanded a force adequate to its task, gave the order to march. The first day they made 2 miles. Braddock had ordered Major Chapman of the 44th Regiment, supported by Sir John St. Clair, the Army's Deputy Quartermaster General, to take command of 600 axemen and cut a military road over Haystack Mountain, following roughly the line of an old native trace known as Nemacolin's Path. The path was adequate for a single horseman or a small trading party. It was not adequate for the requirements of an 18th century European army moving heavy siege artillery. The road they had to build needed to be at least 12 feet wide. It had to be stable enough to support the weight of brass cannons, the largest of them weighing well over a ton, being dragged by horse teams across uneven ground. It had to be cleared not just at ground level, but to a sufficient height that the guns and their carriages could pass without snagging on overhanging branches. It had to bridge streams. It had to circumnavigate the worst of the rocky outcroppings. It had to do all of this through forest that no British engineer had ever surveyed. After a single day of labor, Chapman's 600 axemen had completed 2 miles of road. In the process, they had broken 3 supply wagons on the steep grades and exhausted both the men and the draft horses. At that rate, the army would reach Fort Duquesne sometime in the autumn, assuming the French waited for them, which the French would not. The expedition was saved from immediate collapse by the unlikely intervention of a Royal Navy officer. Lieutenant Spendlow, attached to the column with a small naval detachment to assist with bridging and engineering work, scouted ahead and discovered a passable route through what locals called the Narrows, a defile that bypassed Haystack Mountain's worst grades. The army diverted onto Spendlow's route. The pace improved, not dramatically, but enough to keep the campaign alive. Even with the revised route, the labor was murderous. The crossing of Laurel Hill, a long, rocky ridge running roughly north to south across the Army's path, required individual effort that bordered on the surreal. Each of the 4 8-inch brass howitzers needed a team of 9 horses to drag it up the steep grades. When the horses were not strong enough, the men put ropes on the guns themselves and hauled them. They cut trees. They built corduroy roads, log surfaces laid horizontally across muddy ground, for miles at a time. They bridged streams with felled timber. They fought heat, insects, dysentery, and the slow grinding fatigue of men who had been issued European pattern uniforms and required to wear them in a mid-Atlantic summer. The casualties from disease and exhaustion began before the army had seen an enemy. Men collapsed on the road. Some died. Others were sent back to Fort Cumberland in supply wagons returning for additional provisions. The hospital at the fort, where Charlotte Brown kept her journal, began filling with men who had been broken not by combat, but by the act of getting to the combat. Braddock grew increasingly alarmed. Each day that passed was a day in which French reinforcements might reach Fort Duquesne. His intelligence, such as it was, derived mostly from native scouts and traders whose reports he was not inclined to fully trust, suggested that the fort's current garrison was small. If he could arrive before reinforcements did, the fort would fall almost without resistance. If he arrived after, he would face a defended position with diminished combat power and exhausted troops. It was at this point that George Washington, riding beside Braddock as volunteer aide-de-camp, offered a suggestion that would shape the entire remainder of the campaign. Washington proposed that Braddock split his force. The general should take command of a fast-moving flying column of selected regulars, the best provincials, and a reduced artillery train. He should push ahead at maximum speed, leaving the heavy baggage, the slower wagons, and the bulk of the supplies under a rearguard commander. the flying column could reach Fort Duquesne in days. The rear guard would catch up afterward. The suggestion was tactically sound. It was also, in its way, a confession. The traditional European model of campaign, an army moving together with full logistical support, building roads as it went, was not going to work in this terrain on the timeline Braddock needed. Washington was suggesting a modified approach, one closer to colonial frontier methods, that accepted certain risks in exchange for speed. Braddock accepted the proposal. He took command of a flying column of approximately 1,300 to 1,400 men. Elite companies from the 44th and 48th Regiments, picked Virginia Provincials, the lighter artillery, and a reduced supply train. He left Colonel Thomas Dunbar in command of a reserve division of 800 men, the heavy guns, the bulk of the wagons, and the slower-moving baggage. Dunbar's command would follow as fast as conditions allowed. By early July, Dunbar would be roughly 60 miles behind the flying column. Washington himself nearly missed the climactic moment of the campaign he had helped shape. He had been suffering from severe dysentery for weeks, a debilitating illness that had reduced him to riding propped on cushions, sometimes unable to remain on horseback for more than a few hours at a time. By late June, he was so ill that Braddock ordered him to remain behind with Dunbar's division to recover. Washington protested. He had ridden hundreds of miles. He was not going to miss what came next. He insisted that he would rejoin the flying column before the assault on Fort Duquesne, recovered or not. He kept that promise. He rode into Braddock's camp on July 8th, the day before the battle, still weak, still ill, but mounted. He took his place on the general's staff. Within 24 hours, 4 musket balls would pass through his coat. But before the battle, there was the matter of a road that still had to be cut, mountains that still had to be crossed, and an enemy that had been watching the British column for weeks. Native scouts in French employ had tracked Braddock's movements since he left Fort Cumberland. They knew his strength. They knew his pace. They knew where he was going. And they were carrying that intelligence back to a French captain at Fort Duquesne, who was, by the first week of July, running out of time to do anything about it, while Braddock's flying column ground its way through the mountains. The war was already being experienced, in its most intimate and brutal form, by a young Pennsylvania frontiersman who would become one of the most important eyewitnesses to what happened at Fort Duquesne. His name was James Smith. He was 18 years old. He had been hired in May 1755 to help cut a wagon road from Fort Loudon in south-central Pennsylvania, westward toward Braddock's military road. The idea was to establish a supply line from the agricultural counties of Pennsylvania directly to the British Army in the field, easing the logistical burden on Virginia. On July 5, 1755, 4 days before the battle on the Monongahela, Smith was scouting ahead of his road-cutting party when he was ambushed by a Delaware war party. He was captured alive. The Delaware did not kill him. They had other plans. They marched him directly to Fort Duquesne, a journey of several days through forest he had never seen, in the company of warriors whose language he did not speak. He arrived at the fort exhausted, terrified, and entirely unaware of what was about to happen to him. What happened to him was the gauntlet. The gauntlet was a ritualized welcome that native communities across the eastern woodlands used for captives, a test of spirit, a public spectacle, and, for the unlucky, a form of execution. Smith was forced to run between 2 parallel lines of warriors armed with sticks, clubs, switches, and whips. The lines extended for the length of the fort's parade ground. Each warrior was entitled to strike him as he passed. Smith ran. As he neared the end of the lines, a warrior threw a handful of sand directly into his eyes, blinding him. Disoriented, unable to see his attackers, he stumbled and fell. The blows continued. He was beaten until he lost consciousness on the dirt of the parade ground. He woke up inside the fort, in the care of a French surgeon. His wounds had been cleaned and dressed. He was not, it turned out, going to die. What followed was the ritual that explained why he had been brought to Fort Duquesne in the first place. James Smith was not, in the eyes of his captors, a prisoner of war. He was a candidate for adoption. The Delaware had taken him to replace someone. A family member who had died, a son who had been lost in war or to disease. To complete the replacement, Smith had to be ritually transformed from a white settler into a member of the community. His hair was plucked out, leaving only a scalp lock. His body was painted. He was taken to the river by a group of Mohawk women, members of the Caughnawaga community attached to the fort, and immersed in the water repeatedly. The ceremony, he later wrote in his journal, was understood to wash away his white blood and replace it with the blood of the people who had adopted him. He emerged from the river, a member of the Caughnawaga tribe, with all the rights and obligations of any other member of the community. He would live among his adopted people for the next 5 years. He would learn their language. He would hunt with them. He would observe with the careful eye of a man who never quite stopped thinking like an outsider. Every detail of how they organized themselves, how they fought, how they thought about war. The journal he eventually wrote, published in 1799 as an account of the remarkable occurrences in the life and travels of Coler's James Smith, would become one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of 18th century Eastern Woodlands military culture ever produced by a European observer. But in July 1755, that future was unimaginable. Smith was a captive who had just survived the gauntlet, just been adopted into a tribe whose name he could not yet pronounce, and just been given quarters inside a French fort where the entire garrison was preparing for battle. From his vantage point inside the fort's wooden walls, Smith watched what came next. He watched runners come in from the forest with intelligence about the approaching British column. He watched the fort's commander, Captain Claude Pierre Pecaudy de Contrecoeur, hold councils with his officers and his native allies. He watched native warriors arrive from the Great Lakes, Ottawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Wyandot, drawn to Fort Duquesne by the prospect of the campaign against the British. He watched the fort's small population of troops de la marine, French colonial regulars whose duty included frontier service, prepare ammunition, and check equipment. Contrecoeur faced a desperate situation. His garrison, the actual French military presence at Fort Duquesne, consisted of perhaps 250 colonial regulars and a few hundred Canadian militia. His native allies, drawn to the fort over the previous months by the prospect of fighting alongside the French against British encroachment, numbered another 600 or 700. Against him was marching a British army with heavy siege artillery, regular infantry, and the kind of professional engineering capability that could reduce a wooden frontier fort in days. Contrecoeur understood that he could not survive a siege. The fort had been designed to dominate the forks of the Ohio against light, irregular forces, not to withstand brass howitzers in formal battery. If Braddock arrived, deployed his guns, and opened fire, Fort Duquesne would fall. There was, therefore, only one option. The British column had to be stopped before it reached the fort. It had to be stopped on the march, in the forest, in terrain that would negate the British advantages in artillery and discipline. It had to be ambushed. Contrecoeur turned to Captain Daniel Léonard de Beaujeu, an experienced colonial officer with extensive frontier service. Beaujeu would lead a strike force out of the fort to intercept the British column before it arrived. He would take with him a mixed force of French regulars, Canadian militia, and native warriors, 891 men in total by Contrecoeur's tally. The composition would be deliberate. a small corps of European-trained regulars to provide discipline and direction, supplemented by overwhelming numbers of warriors whose tactical skills were perfectly suited to the forest. Beaujeu spent the night of July 8th in council with his native allies. The discussions, according to later French accounts, were not easy. Many of the native leaders were reluctant to engage what they understood to be a much larger British force. They had seen British armies before. They had heard about the artillery. They had no particular desire to die in someone else's war. Beaujeu apparently appealed to them in terms that combined practical military argument with personal commitment. He pointed out that the British had to be stopped, that if Fort Duquesne fell, the entire Ohio Valley would be lost to the French, and by extension, to the native nations whose autonomy depended on French presence as a counterweight to British expansion. He volunteered to lead the strike personally. He stripped to a fringed hunting shirt and accepted the silver gorget that marked him as a French officer of rank. A deliberate gesture, mixing French military formality with frontier dress, intended to demonstrate his commitment to fighting on terms his native allies would recognize. The warriors agreed. On the morning of July 9th, before dawn, Beaujeu led his 891 men out of Fort Duquesne and into the forest, marching east toward the Monongahela River and the British column that was, even then, beginning its final approach to the forks. James Smith watched them go. He did not know whether they would return. He did not know what would happen if they failed. He did not know that within 24 hours, he would be standing on the fort's battlements, watching the consequences of their success. The morning of July 9th, 1755, was hot and humid in the river valley. The Monongahela ran low and clear, brown at the bottom, fringed with the dense forest that came down to its banks in most places. The river makes two sharp bends in the area south of present-day Pittsburgh, and Braddock's planned line of march required him to cross it twice. Once moving north, then again a few miles upstream when the road on the eastern bank became impassable. The first crossing came at dawn. Braddock had been preparing for this moment for weeks. Fort Duquesne was now 8 miles distant. The Monongahela crossing was the last major terrain feature between his army and its objective. Once he had crossed and recrossed the river, he would be on open ground, relatively flat, relatively dry, within striking distance of the fort. He decided to do it in style. This decision tells you almost everything you need to understand about Edward Braddock. He could have crossed the river at first light in column of march, with minimum exposure and maximum operational discretion. The French at Fort Duquesne might not have known he was coming until his guns were within range of their walls. Instead, he ordered his army to cross the river in full ceremonial array. Drums beating, colors flying, officers in full dress uniform, bayonets fixed, the men in line of march by company with proper intervals, exactly as they would have appeared on a parade ground in Hyde Park. It was, to Braddock's mind, a statement. He was projecting the power of British arms into the heart of the French frontier. He wanted any French scouts who might be watching to see exactly what was coming for them. He wanted the local native populations, who he was certain had been wavering in their loyalties, to understand that British imperial authority had arrived in full majesty. And he wanted his own men to feel the weight of their participation in a moment of imperial significance. There was, in his view, no operational cost to this display. The French were 8 miles away, behind fortifications. Any scouts they might have in the area could be dealt with by his advance guard. The army would reform on the far bank, complete the second crossing, and proceed toward the fort. The crossing itself was, in Braddock's understanding, the easy part of the day. George Washington, riding among the officers of Braddock's staff, despite his lingering dysentery, watched the column move across the river with a feeling that he would later describe in letters as something close to awe. The discipline of the regulars, the precision of the formations, the brass and scarlet against the dark water and the green of the surrounding forest. It was, he wrote, the most splendid military spectacle he had ever witnessed. He was 23 years old, and he had spent most of his short military career commanding militia in muddy stockades. The British Army crossing the Monongahela in line of march was the empire made visible, made tangible, made present in the wilderness he had grown up in. He would carry that image for the rest of his life. 21 years later, when he was commanding the Continental Army against the same British regulars, he would still remember it. He would remember how it had felt to believe, for one morning, that he was witnessing something invincible. The first crossing was completed without incident. The army proceeded north along the riverbank for several miles, then prepared for the second crossing. By midday, the entire flying column was across the Monongahela for the second and final time. The ground ahead rose gently toward the northwest. The forest closed in around the road, which had been cut to a width of approximately 12 feet. Sufficient for the wagons, sufficient for the artillery, sufficient for the column of regulars marching 3 or 4 abreast. The advance guard moved out first. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage, yes, the same Thomas Gage who would, 20 years later, command the British garrison in Boston when the American Revolution began, led a force of approximately 300 grenadiers, supported by 2 6-pounder cannons, 2 engineers, and a working party of about 250 men, whose job was to widen the road and clear any obstructions for the main column following behind. The advance guard's mission was to secure the route, to detect any French presence, to engage and drive off any opposition that might appear. Gage was 36 years old. He was the second son of an English viscount. He had served at Fontenoy and at Culloden. He was an experienced regimental officer who, by the standards of the British Army in 1755, qualified as a thoughtful and competent professional. He took his advance guard up the road in standard British column of march, with flankers extending into the woods on both sides to detect ambushes. The flankers were inadequate. They had been issued no special training for forest work. They were regular British infantry in red coats, attempting to push through dense undergrowth that they were entirely unprepared to navigate. They made noise. They got separated from the column. They reported nothing. Behind Gage's advance guard, separated by approximately 100 yards, came the working party. Behind the working party, separated by another gap, came the main body under Braddock himself. The bulk of the regulars, the rest of the artillery, the wagons, and the rear guard under Colonel Peter Halkett of the 44th Regiment. The entire column stretched along nearly a mile of road. Front to back, Braddock had perhaps 2,400 men distributed across a narrow corridor 12 feet wide and 4,000 feet long. It was, in retrospect, a formation almost specifically designed for what was about to happen to it. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, on a road that has since been swallowed by suburban Pittsburgh, the British advance guard met Captain Daniel Leonard de Beaujeu's strike force coming the other way. Neither side had expected the meeting at that exact location. Beaujeu had hoped to ambush the British at the river crossing itself, to catch them in the act of fording the Monongahela when they would be most vulnerable. He had been too late. By the time his force arrived at the planned ambush site, the British had already completed both crossings and were several miles inland. Beaujeu now had a choice. He could withdraw, abandon the engagement, and accept that the British would reach Fort Duquesne. Or he could press forward, find the British wherever they were, and fight on whatever ground he encountered them. He pressed forward. His native allies, having committed to the engagement, were not inclined to retreat. The terrain ahead of them, the rising ground beyond the second river crossing, was wooded, ravined, and well suited to the kind of fight they preferred. If they could not catch the British at the river, they would catch them in the woods. The two columns met on the road at almost exactly the worst possible moment for the British. Gage's advance guard had just passed a slight rise in the terrain. Ahead of them, the road continued through a corridor flanked by two deep, wooded ravines, one on either side, running roughly parallel to the road for several hundred yards. The ravines were 8 or 10 feet deep, choked with brush, and almost invisible from the road itself unless you were looking for them. They were perfect natural trenches. The first contact was sudden. A French officer, possibly Beaujeu himself, possibly a scout, appeared on the road ahead of Gage's grenadiers. The British advance guard, well drilled and well led, reacted exactly as their training prescribed. They formed line. They presented arms. They delivered a controlled volley. The volley killed Captain Daniel Léonard de Beaujeu in the opening minutes of the engagement. What happened next demonstrated the difference between European linear warfare and the war that the British Army had just walked into. Beaujeu's death created momentary confusion in the French and native force. The Canadian militia, less committed to the engagement than the regulars or the warriors, began to break and flee. For a few seconds, the British advance guard was actually winning the firefight. Then Captain Jean-Daniel Dumas, Beaujeu's second-in-command, took control. Dumas had served on the frontier for years. He understood, as Beaujeu had, that what the British Army required was the war that European training prescribed, and what the British Army was about to receive was the war the forest dictated. He ordered the troops de la Marine to hold the road. He signaled the native warriors, Ottawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Wyandot, Lenape, Mingo, Shawnee, perhaps 600 or 700 fighters in total, to do what they had been waiting for. To do what their tactical tradition had perfected over generations of intertribal warfare. To disappear into the ravines. The warriors fanned out left and right from the road. They moved through the woods at speed, taking up firing positions in the ravines on either side of the British column. Within minutes, the British advance guard found itself caught in a crossfire from two parallel lines of marksmen, invisible behind the lip of the ravines, firing from cover at a target that was exposed on every side. The crossfire was devastating. The warriors fired from prone positions, from behind logs, from behind trees. They reloaded under cover. They selected their targets with care. Officers first, then the men carrying colors, then the men working the cannons. Every shot from the ravines came from concealment. Every shot from the British line came from soldiers standing in the open, in the middle of a 12-foot road, with no clear sense of where their attackers actually were. The grenadiers tried to do what they had been trained to do. They formed line of battle across the road. They presented arms. They delivered volleys into the trees on either side, firing into vegetation in the general direction of the muzzle flashes that were the only visible signature of the enemy. The volleys felled branches and scattered leaves. They did not, except by chance, hit the men firing back. Lieutenant Colonel Gage, watching his command begin to take serious casualties, recognized what was happening. He ordered the grenadiers to advance up the rising ground on the right, to seize the high ground that flanked the road and clear the ravines from above. It was the correct decision. It was, in fact, the only correct decision. The men refused. This is one of the most consequential moments of the battle, and it requires a moment of attention. The British regulars who refused Gage's order were not cowards. They had stood in line and taken aimed fire from concealed marksmen for several minutes already. What they refused to do was leave the road. The road was the only feature of the terrain they recognized. The road was where their formation existed. The road was where their officers were. To step off the road into the forest was to enter a chaos for which they had no doctrine and no training. They stayed on the road. They continued to fire into the trees. They continued to die. Within 20 minutes of first contact, Gage's advance guard had lost approximately a third of its strength. The grenadiers began to fall back down the road, toward the working party, toward the main body, toward what they hoped was the reinforcement and order represented by the columns behind them. The reinforcement was coming. Lieutenant Colonel Burton, commanding a column of reinforcements from the main body, was pushing forward up the road in response to the sound of firing. The working party, caught in the middle, had nowhere to go, and so the three British columns, the retreating advance guard, the stationary working party, the advancing reinforcement, converged on a single point of the road. Hundreds of men, packed shoulder to shoulder in a corridor 12 feet wide, taking fire from concealed marksmen in ravines on both sides. The bottleneck became a slaughter. The Battle of the Monongahela was decided in its first hour. Everything that happened after the initial collision was the working out of consequences that had already been determined by geometry. Consider what the warriors in the ravines were looking at. They had taken up positions on both sides of a narrow road. The road was 12 feet wide. The road was filled with hundreds of British soldiers in scarlet coats. The British soldiers were standing upright, in close order, attempting to deliver volleys at an enemy they could not see. Every shot fired from the ravines into that mass of red cloth was almost guaranteed to hit something. Every shot fired from the road into the ravines had to penetrate trees, brush, and concealment to find a target. The mathematical reality was inescapable. The warriors had a target-rich environment with excellent cover. The British had no target and no cover at all. Within an hour of first contact, the road had become almost impassable. Bodies of dead and wounded soldiers lay where they had fallen. The wagon train, brought forward by the noise of the firing, jammed in behind the retreating advance guard. The two 6-pounder cannons that had been with Gage's vanguard were rolled back into the road, then dragged forward again by Braddock's orders, then abandoned when their gun crews were systematically shot down by warriors who had identified them as priority targets. The artillery, which Braddock had counted on as his decisive advantage, fired perhaps a dozen rounds before falling silent. Sir Peter Halkett of the 44th Regiment, commanding the rear of the column, brought his men forward to support the engagement. He deployed them in 2 ranks on both sides of the road, attempting to extend the British line of fire into the flanks. A 12-pounder cannon was brought up and fired by platoons. None of it mattered. The warriors in the ravines simply shifted their positions as the British attempted to deploy, maintaining their angles of fire, picking off the men in scarlet wherever they appeared. Halkett himself was shot and killed during the action. His son, Lieutenant James Halkett, saw his father fall. He ran through the firing toward the spot where his father lay. He reached his father's body and was shot dead beside him in almost the same moment. Father and son were left where they fell, on the road, in the smoke. Their bodies would still be there years later. When British forces under General John Forbes finally reached the forks of the Ohio in 1758 and discovered the bones of the army that had preceded them, the geometry of the road did one more thing. It funneled the British into formations that maximized their casualties. When Burton's reinforcements collided with Gage's retreating advance guard, the result was not the orderly relief that Braddock had imagined. It was a compression. The men on the road had no lateral space to maneuver, no way to move off the road into the surrounding forest without abandoning their formation entirely. and no way to advance or retreat without colliding with the units in front of or behind them. They became a crowd of soldiers in red coats, packed together in a narrow corridor, standing in the open, taking aimed fire from concealed positions on three sides. The warriors in the ravines had to do almost nothing to ensure that every shot found a target. They simply had to keep firing. Lieutenant Colonel Burton, attempting to execute Braddock's order to charge the rising hill on the right, found that his column was hopelessly entangled with Gage's retreating men and with the elements of St. Clair's working party that had been swept up in the collision. Sir John St. Clair himself, the Army's quartermaster general, had warned Braddock about the rising hill before the engagement began. He had identified it as the dominant terrain feature on the right flank of the road. He had recommended that it be cleared before the column advanced past it. His advice had been disregarded. He would, in the course of the day, be wounded twice while attempting to organize the British response to the very threat he had predicted. And through all of this, through the collapse of the advance guard, the entanglement of the reinforcements, the systematic destruction of the artillery, Edward Braddock remained on his horse in the middle of the road. He rode through the firing as if he were on a parade ground. He shouted orders. He ordered his men to dress their ranks, to form line of battle, to deliver disciplined volleys into the woods on either side. He had 4 horses shot from under him in the course of the afternoon, mounting a fresh one each time. He saw provincial troops, Virginians who had grown up in this kind of country, who knew exactly what to do when bullets came from concealment, taking cover behind trees and returning fire from individual positions. He saw them, and he was furious. He drew his saber. He rode among the provincials, striking them with the flat of the blade, screaming at them to leave their cover, to form ranks, to fight as soldiers and not as Indians. He drove them back into the road. He drove them into the killing ground. He killed his own men more efficiently than the warriors in the ravines by refusing to let them survive. This is the moment, in any account of the Battle of the Monongahela, where you have to stop and reckon with what Edward Braddock actually was. He was not a stupid man. He was not even, by the standards of his profession, an incompetent man. He was a man who had spent 45 years internalizing a particular theory of warfare so completely that he could not, when the theory was failing in real time around him, do anything except apply it more strenuously. The provincials behind trees were not, in his framework, soldiers fighting effectively. They were soldiers in mutiny. He responded to what he perceived as mutiny in the only way his training prescribed. He punished it. He killed his army to save the parade ground. In the middle of this disintegration, one figure moved with what witnesses afterward described as a kind of impossible calm. George Washington was still recovering from dysentery. He was so weak that he had ridden into camp the day before with cushions on his saddle to ease the pain of remaining mounted. He had no formal command. He was a volunteer aide-de-camp, with no rank that the British Army officially recognized. He should have been a peripheral figure in the battle. He became, instead, one of the few elements of the British command structure that continued to function. Braddock had begun the day with several aides-de-camp. By mid-afternoon, every one of them had been killed or wounded, except Washington. The native marksmen in the ravines had identified the officers on horseback as priority targets. They had worked through them systematically. Washington alone remained mounted, remained uninjured, and remained capable of carrying orders from Braddock to whatever fragments of the British command still functioned. He rode through the crossfire repeatedly. He carried orders to Gage. He carried orders to Burton. He attempted to organize a rear guard as the situation deteriorated. He worked to identify what remained of the provincial troops and to position them in ways that might cover the retreat. He did all of this while a battle was disintegrating around him. while officers were dying in numbers that suggested deliberate targeting, while the man he had volunteered to serve was riding his way through one horse after another in the middle of the road. 2 horses were shot out from under Washington in the course of the afternoon. 4 musket balls passed through his coat. 1 passed through his hat. None touched his body. He wrote about it afterward in a letter to his brother John Augustine Washington, dated July 18, 1755, with the kind of restraint that characterized his entire life as a writer. "By the all-powerful dispensations of Providence," he wrote, "I have been protected beyond all human probability or expectation. For I had 4 bullets through my coat, and 2 horses shot under me, and yet escaped unhurt, although death was leveling my companions on every side of me." The letter is preserved today at Mount Vernon. It is one of the most striking documents in early American military history, not for what it claims, but for what it does not claim. Washington did not present himself as having performed extraordinary feats. He presented himself as having survived something that should have killed him many times over, and as having concluded that the only available explanation was divine intervention. The native warriors who fired at him during the battle drew their own conclusions. Years later, decades later in fact, Washington's personal physician, Dr. James Craik, who had been with him at the Monongahela and would remain a lifelong friend, recorded an encounter that took place during a 1770 expedition to the Ohio country. Washington and Craik met with a delegation of native leaders who had come specifically to see the tall Virginian whose reputation, by then, had reached them through years of frontier communication. One of the leaders was a Delaware chief named Red Hawk. He told Washington, through an interpreter, that he had fought at the Battle of the Monongahela. He had been one of the warriors in the ravines. He had personally identified Washington as a target. The tall officer on horseback who kept riding through the crossfire without falling. Red Hawk had fired his rifle at Washington 11 times. He had not missed often in his long career as a warrior. He had not understood why he could not hit this particular man. After the 11th shot, he had told the warriors near him to stop shooting at the Virginian. There was no point. The man was protected by a great spirit. He could not be killed by bullets. He was meant for some other end. It is one of those stories that stands at the edge of legend, the kind of account that may have been embellished in the telling and the retelling. The basic facts, however, are documented in Craik's papers and in the recollections of other witnesses to the 1770 meeting. Whether Red Hawk fired 11 shots or merely several, whether his words have been preserved exactly or rendered loosely, the substance of the encounter is reasonably well attested. A Delaware warrior who had fought at the Monongahela came specifically to meet Washington 15 years later, told him that he had tried to kill him during the battle, and explained why he had eventually stopped trying. Washington carried that story for the rest of his life. He never made much of it publicly. He was not the sort of man who built personal myths around providential survival. But the experience of the Monongahela, of riding through a firestorm that killed everyone around him without touching him, seems to have produced in him something close to a settled conviction that his life was, for reasons he did not pretend to understand, going to be spent in service to something larger than himself. Around the moment Washington was carrying his 5th or 6th set of orders across the battlefield, Edward Braddock was finally shot. The musket ball struck him in the right side, passed through his arm, and lodged in his lung. He fell from his horse. He was, by all accounts, still conscious. He was still in command, in the sense that he continued to issue orders to those nearby. But he could no longer ride. He could no longer move under his own power. He could only lie on the forest floor while his army died around him. Washington reached him, So did Colonel Nicholas Merriweather and several other officers who had survived the targeting of Braddock's staff. They got the general onto a makeshift stretcher. The stretcher was improvised from Braddock's own crimson silk officer's sash, a heavy ceremonial item, woven from silk using a specialized technique called sprang weaving, designed for exactly this kind of emergency use. The sash was strong enough to bear a wounded man's weight. They lifted Braddock onto it and began the slow, dangerous work of carrying him off the field. The battle at that point was effectively over. What remained of the British force began a disorganized retreat back down the road they had come up, back toward the second river crossing, back toward the territory they had spent weeks fighting their way through. Washington helped organize what passed for a rear guard. He kept enough of a screen between the retreating column and the battlefield to prevent the warriors from pursuing in force. The pursuit, as it turned out, did not press. The French and native force had won a victory beyond anything they had imagined possible. They had on the field hundreds of dead and dying British regulars. They had abandoned artillery. They had supply wagons. They had paymasters' chests. They had Braddock's personal baggage, which included his official correspondence, letters from the British government, intelligence reports, plans for the entire 1755 campaign across North America. The warriors and the French colonial troops alike turned their attention to securing the plunder and rounding up the abandoned horses. They let the survivors go. Washington brought what remained of the army back across the Monongahela. He brought Braddock with them, still alive, still conscious, still able to speak. The general was carried, in agonizing stages, away from the battlefield. He would survive for 4 more days. He would not survive longer than that. But before he died, his men would still have to live through the night of July 10th. When something happened on the banks of the Allegheny River that James Smith would watch from the walls of Fort Duquesne and never forget. The retreat of Braddock's broken army moved east along the road they had cut, carrying their wounded general, abandoning their dead, leaving behind everything they could not transport. They moved through the night and into the next day. They moved with the particular silence of men who have just survived something they do not yet understand. Behind them, at Fort Duquesne, the victorious force returned in stages through the late afternoon and evening of July 9th. The native warriors came in first, in small groups, carrying plunder and prisoners. The French regulars and Canadian militia followed. Captain Dumas, who had inherited command after Beaujeu's death in the opening minutes of the engagement, reported to Contrecoeur. The fort's commander, who had spent the day waiting for news in a state somewhere between hope and resignation, learned that his entire strategic problem had been solved. The British army was destroyed, not defeated. Destroyed. Fort Duquesne would not have to withstand a siege. The Ohio country was not going to fall in the summer of 1755. James Smith was still inside the fort. He had spent the day not knowing what was happening. He had listened to the sound of distant firing miles away to the south, and he had not known whether it meant a French victory, a French defeat, or some inconclusive engagement that would eventually bring British troops to the fort's gates. By evening, he had his answer. The warriors came back. They brought trophies. They brought stories. They brought also prisoners. 12 British regular soldiers had been taken alive. They had been captured at various points during the battle and the brief pursuit that followed. They were brought back to Fort Duquesne the next evening, July 10th, 1755. And what happened next was something Smith would describe in his journal in restrained but unmistakable detail. The 12 prisoners were stripped to their natural state, their hands bound above their heads, and led out of the fort to the sandy banks of the Allegheny River, close enough to the fort that everything that followed could be seen from its walls. A large crowd gathered. native warriors from multiple nations, French regulars and officers, Canadian militia, even some of the women and children attached to the fort's various communities. The prisoners were tied to wooden stakes that had been prepared along the riverbank. What followed was a ritualized execution, whose form had been developed over generations of warfare among the nations of the eastern woodlands. It was not random cruelty. It was a structured ceremony with its own internal logic, in which the prisoners' deaths served specific symbolic and political functions. To say this is not to defend or excuse it. It is to acknowledge what Smith himself acknowledged in his journal: that he was watching something he understood, intellectually, as a meaningful act within the cultural framework of the people he had been adopted into, even as he watched it as a horror against people who looked like him. The warriors began the executions with heated iron bars applied to the bound prisoners. They drove resinous pine splinters into the prisoners' bodies and set the splinters alight. The prisoners burned slowly. Smith, watching from the fort's battlements, could hear them clearly. Anyone in the fort that evening could hear them. The screams carried across the water and up to the walls. The executions proceeded one at a time. As each man died, the next was prepared. The waiting prisoners stood in their tight group, bound, naked, forced to watch what was being done to their comrades and to know that it would shortly be done to them. The ceremony continued through the evening and into the night. By the time it was complete, all 12 British prisoners had been killed. Smith noted in his journal something specific and damning about Captain Contrecoeur, the French commandant of Fort Duquesne. The executions took place in full view and earshot of the fort. Contrecoeur was the senior French officer present. He had operational authority over his native allies in the sense that they had fought under his strategic direction. He could have intervened. He could have asked his allies to spare the prisoners, or to kill them quickly, or to conduct the executions further from the fort. He did none of these things. He made no effort to stop or moderate what was happening. The screams of the dying British regulars, Smith wrote, rang clearly in the ears of every French officer in the fort, and no French officer raised an objection. This is a difficult passage in any honest account of the Battle of the Monongahela, because it requires the reader to hold several things at once. The European framework of just war and the native framework of ritual warfare were not the same framework. Native communities were fighting a war they had not started. On behalf of allies, they had chosen for their own strategic reasons, against enemies whose victory would have ended their political autonomy and likely their physical existence. The execution of prisoners at the Allegheny was, within that framework, a comprehensible act. Though, even within that framework, it was unusually severe. But the French were not native. The French were a European Christian power, claiming to wage war according to European rules. Contrecoeur's silence, his refusal to intervene, his apparent willingness to allow ritualized executions of helpless prisoners to occur within sight and sound of his command, was a moral choice that French officers would later have to defend, and that Smith's testimony would help ensure they could not defend successfully. The 12 men who died on the bank of the Allegheny that night were not strategically important. They had no information of value. They had no political significance. Their executions changed nothing about the campaign. But their deaths became part of the British and colonial American memory of the war, in a way that would shape every subsequent engagement on the frontier. The story of what happened on the night of July 10th, 1755, would be told and retold in colonial newspapers, in soldiers' memoirs, in the testimonies of captives who eventually returned to the British settlements. It would harden colonial attitudes toward both the French and their native allies. It would contribute to the gradual collapse of the careful diplomatic distinctions that had previously governed frontier conflict. It would also, eventually, contribute to something else. The men who returned from the Monongahela and the men who heard their stories from the safety of Philadelphia and Williamsburg and Boston drew a specific lesson from the experience. The British government, they concluded, was not going to protect them. The British Army, even at full strength under a serving general, could not be relied upon to defeat the French in their own preferred terrain. If colonial Americans were going to survive on the frontier, they were going to have to learn to fight there themselves, on terms the frontier itself dictated. That lesson took 20 years to mature into political consequence. But it began on the night of July 10th, 1755, on the banks of the Allegheny River, with the screams of 12 men who died because Edward Braddock had marched 1,400 soldiers into a forest he did not understand, under a flag he believed would protect them. The broken remnants of Braddock's army reached Colonel Thomas Dunbar's camp on July 10th, the same evening that the executions were occurring on the Allegheny. Dunbar's reserve division, 800 men, the heavy artillery, the bulk of the wagons, the slower supplies, had been struggling along Braddock's road for weeks, perpetually a few days behind the flying column. They had heard nothing from Braddock since the army had split. The first indication they received that something had gone wrong came in the form of survivors stumbling into camp from the west. Men in torn uniforms, men without weapons, men carrying wounded comrades on improvised stretchers, men who could not, for the first day, even articulate what had happened. Dunbar took stock of what had arrived. Of approximately 1,400 men who had crossed the Monongahela with Braddock, perhaps 500 reached the reserve camp under their own power. Hundreds more would trickle in over the following days. The final accounting would establish that 977 of the 1,159 British troops actively engaged had been killed or wounded, a casualty rate of 67%. The officer corps had been particularly devastated. Of 86 officers engaged, 26 were killed and 37 wounded, 63 casualties total. Among the dead were Sir Peter Halket, 2nd Baronet, commanding the 44th Regiment, and his youngest son, Lieutenant James Halket. Braddock's own military secretary, William Shirley, Jr., son of the Massachusetts governor, and dozens of company officers and subalterns whose names filled the casualty returns for months afterward. The French and native coalition reported losses of 23 killed and 20 wounded, 43 total casualties. Dunbar, now the senior surviving officer of the expedition, made a decision that has been controversial ever since. He concluded that the Army's offensive capability had been comprehensively destroyed. The flying column was shattered. His own reserve division, while intact, was not large enough or properly organized to continue the campaign alone. The expedition's logistical tail had been broken. The men were demoralized to the point of disintegration. There was no plausible scenario in which the British could regroup, return to the Forks, and complete the original mission in 1755. He ordered the destruction of all heavy equipment that could not be carried back to Fort Cumberland. Cannons were spiked and abandoned or pushed into the rivers. Supplies that could not be transported were burned. Wagons were broken up for firewood or left where they stood. Within days, Dunbar's command was retreating eastward along Braddock's road, leaving behind hundreds of thousands of pounds sterling worth of equipment that had been laboriously dragged through the mountains over the preceding 2 months. Critics afterward, particularly in the colonial press, accused Dunbar of an effectively cowardly withdrawal, of abandoning the frontier when his command remained substantially intact, of essentially conceding the Ohio country to the French when more vigorous leadership might have salvaged something from the disaster. The criticism had some merit. It also had limits. Dunbar was managing what remained of a catastrophe, not commanding a campaign of choice. On the night of July 13th, 1755, 4 days after the battle, General Edward Braddock died of his wounds at a campsite near Great Meadows, not far from where, the previous summer, George Washington had surrendered Fort Necessity. He had been carried in stages from the battlefield, conscious for much of the journey, in agony throughout. Witnesses recorded his last words variously. "Who would have thought it?" some reported. "We shall know better how to deal with them another time," reported others. Whether either quotation is accurate, neither has the ring of complete invention. Both express something that was probably present in Braddock's mind during his final days. The disorientation of a man whose entire professional framework had been disassembled in front of him, and the residual military pride that refused, even in dying, to concede that the framework itself had been wrong. Before he died, Braddock did something that history has remembered. He gave George Washington 2 specific objects from his personal possessions. The first was a pair of silver-mounted flintlock pistols, beautifully crafted weapons, the kind of personal sidearms that a British general of Braddock's rank would have carried throughout his career. The second was the crimson silk sash that had served as his stretcher during the retreat. Both objects were, in their way, transfers of authority. The pistols were the personal weapons of command. The sash was the visible insignia of an officer's rank. Braddock was, in his final hours, recognizing that something had passed between him and the young Virginian who had carried him off the field. The next day, July 14th, Washington oversaw Braddock's burial. He was 23 years old. He had just survived a battle that had killed nearly everyone around him. He was now, in effect, the senior officer with operational responsibility for what came next. Dunbar was technically in command, but Washington had become the visible authority among the survivors of the flying column. And the burial of the general was, by mutual understanding, his responsibility. He chose to bury Braddock in the middle of the road. The reasoning was practical and specific. The army was retreating. The French and their native allies might pursue or might send scouts to monitor the British withdrawal. A general's grave, if marked, would be obvious to any scout who passed it. Scouts who found such a grave might exhume the body to take Braddock's scalp, his uniform, his rings, anything of value or symbolic significance. Washington was determined that this would not happen. So he had Braddock interred in the middle of the dirt roadbed itself, in a shallow grave with no marker. Once the body was in the ground, Washington ordered the remaining wagons and the retreating foot soldiers to march back and forth across the gravesite repeatedly. The wagon wheels and the boots of hundreds of men flattened the earth, packed the soil, erased every visible sign that anyone had been buried there. By the time the last of the column had passed, the road looked exactly as it had before. There was no grave to find. There was only road. Braddock's burial in the middle of his own road has become one of the iconic images of the Monongahela campaign. It is the perfect metaphor. The British general, killed by a war he did not understand, hidden beneath the surface of the very infrastructure his army had built to deliver him to his death. The road carried him into the wilderness. The road consumed him on the way out. The grave was, in fact, lost. For half a century, no one knew exactly where Edward Braddock lay. He had become, in a literal sense, part of the ground his army had failed to conquer. In 1804, 49 years after the burial, road workers improving the old Braddock Road near Great Meadows uncovered human remains in the middle of the roadbed. The bones were scattered, partially deteriorated, but unmistakably human. Among them were vertebrae and the bones of a hand, fragments of a skeleton that had been buried beneath the road's surface for nearly half a century. Several of the workmen reportedly took bones as souvenirs before a local magistrate intervened and ordered their return. The recovered remains were reinterred on a small knoll adjacent to the roadbed. A marble monument was erected at the site in 1913, marking what is now known as Braddock's grave. The bones did not all stay together. The hand bones were acquired by Charles Willson Peale, the famous Philadelphia artist and museum proprietor. When Peale's museum failed, the collection was sold to P.T. Barnum and lost in the catastrophic fire that destroyed Barnum's American Museum in 1864. The vertebrae took a different path. They eventually came into the possession of the Walter Reed Army Medical Museum, where they remain today. Fragments of Edward Braddock kept in glass cases as anatomical specimens, the residue of an empire that briefly imagined itself invincible in the forests of Pennsylvania. The other artifacts survived in better condition. The crimson silk sash that had served as Braddock's stretcher and then been passed to Washington remained in Washington's personal collection for the rest of his life. It was preserved at Mount Vernon after his death, then passed through various owners before being presented to General Zachary Taylor in 1846. From Taylor, it eventually entered the holdings of J.P. Morgan, Jr., who purchased it in 1924 and returned it to Mount Vernon. It is on display there today. A length of woven crimson silk more than 250 years old that once carried a dying British general off a battlefield and was then given to the man who would, 2 decades later, lead the army that broke the empire Braddock served. The silver-mounted pistols Braddock gave Washington passed eventually into the holdings of the Smithsonian. Washington's own silver-hilted small sword, depicted in Charles Willson Peale's 1772 portrait of him, was donated to Mount Vernon by J.P. Morgan Sr. in 1909 and is displayed there alongside the sash. These objects survived because they came to be understood as more than personal possessions. They were the material residue of a transmission, a transfer of authority, however informal, from a British general dying in the wilderness to a provincial officer who would carry the lessons of that wilderness into a different war. 3 years after the Monongahela, in 1758, the British launched a second campaign to take Fort Duquesne. Command fell to Brigadier General John Forbes, a Scottish officer of considerable intelligence, broken health, and unusual willingness to learn from prior failure. Forbes spent months studying the previous campaign. He read the surviving accounts. He interviewed Washington, who was now a regimental commander participating in the Forbes expedition. He looked at what Braddock had done, and he did almost everything differently. Forbes refused to follow Braddock's road. He cut a new route, further north, through Pennsylvania rather than Virginia. He moved more slowly than Braddock, but with more deliberation, building fortified posts at intervals along the line of march, creating a secure logistical chain that could not be cut by a single defeat. He invested heavily in diplomacy with native communities, recognizing what Braddock had refused to recognize: that the war in the Ohio country could not be won without at least some native cooperation. The Treaty of Easton, signed in October 1758, secured commitments from several key Ohio Valley tribes to withdraw from active French alliance in exchange for British acknowledgement of their land claims east of the Alleghenies. When Forbes's column approached Fort Duquesne in late November 1758, the French garrison faced a transformed strategic situation. Their native allies were not coming. Their supplies were running low. The French commander, recognizing that the fort could not be held, blew up its magazines and burned it to the ground. Forbes occupied the smoking ruins on November 25, 1758, 3 years and 4 months after Braddock's disaster on the Monongahela. The forks of the Ohio became British territory. The site of Fort Duquesne was renamed in honor of William Pitt. The British Prime Minister, whose strategy had reorganized the war effort. Fort Pitt would grow into the city of Pittsburgh. Forbes had succeeded where Braddock had failed. His success was not the product of greater military genius. It was the product of having read Braddock's defeat carefully and having drawn from it the specific conclusions that Braddock himself had been incapable of drawing. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 ended the French and Indian War with French power in North America effectively destroyed. France ceded Canada to Britain. France ceded all territory east of the Mississippi. The Ohio Country, the prize for which Braddock had marched and died, became part of the British Empire. But the resolution carried within it the seeds of the next conflict. The British government, having won an enormous war at enormous cost, attempted to recover some of that cost by taxing the American colonies more aggressively. The Stamp Act, the Townshend duties, the coercive acts of the early 1770s. The colonists who had watched the British Army fail at the Monongahela, who had concluded that they could not rely on imperial protection and would have to defend themselves, now found themselves being asked to pay for an empire that had not, in their experience, been particularly competent at the work of defending them. The officers who survived the Monongahela carried specific lessons forward. George Washington took from the battle a permanent appreciation for the limits of conventional European tactics in American conditions, and a personal conviction that he had been preserved by Providence for some purpose he did not yet fully grasp. Thomas Gage, who had commanded the advance guard, would become commander-in-chief of British forces in North America. The man who would, in 1775, order the march on Lexington and Concord that began the American Revolution. Horatio Gates, wounded at the Monongahela as a captain, would command American forces at Saratoga in 1777. Daniel Morgan, who had served as a teamster in Braddock's army, would become one of the most effective irregular commanders of the Revolutionary War, winning the Battle of Cowpens in 1781. The officers who learned at the Monongahela that the British Army could be defeated in American terrain went on to defeat the British Army in American terrain. The very lessons that the Monongahela taught, the importance of cover, the use of terrain, the value of marksmanship over volume fire, the integration of irregular and regular forces, the necessity of local alliances, became, in the hands of the men who learned them, the tactical foundation of the American Revolutionary cause. The British Empire that Braddock had served had, in the course of a single afternoon in 1755, inadvertently trained the officers who would dismantle it. This is not the kind of historical pattern that gets emphasized in popular memory. The Battle of the Monongahela does not appear on most lists of consequential engagements. It is overshadowed by Bunker Hill, Saratoga, Yorktown. Even though it produced many of the officers and almost all of the tactical lessons those later battles depended on, it is overshadowed too by the more dramatic episodes of the French and Indian War itself. The Siege of Louisbourg, the death of James Wolfe at Quebec. Wolfe's death produced a famous painting. Braddock's death produced an unmarked grave under a dirt road. But the Monongahela is the engagement where the actual military balance of British North America was first revealed. Wolfe's victory at Quebec confirmed British conventional superiority in pitched battles on open ground. Braddock's defeat at the Monongahela revealed that this superiority did not extend to the conditions under which most North American conflict actually took place. 67% casualties in 3 hours. An entire army shattered by an enemy force 2/3 its size. A general buried beneath his own road. A young Virginian who lived through the firestorm and would, in time, build a different kind of army out of the lessons of that afternoon. Empire's hubris, paid for at the Monongahela, would be paid for again at Saratoga and at Yorktown. by the descendants of the same imperial system against the descendants of the same tactical insights, in wars whose outcomes were prefigured in the forest where Edward Braddock died. The site of the Battle of the Monongahela today is unrecognizable as a battlefield. It lies within the suburbs of Pittsburgh, in the borough of Braddock, Pennsylvania. The ravines that funneled fire into the British column have been partially filled, partially built over. Streets and houses cover what was once forest. A historical marker stands near the location of the heaviest fighting, small and easy to miss. The Braddock Road exists today in fragments. Portions have been incorporated into modern highways. Others survive as walking trails in state parks. Most has been absorbed into the landscape, surviving in name only on local maps that show Braddock Road, running between communities that no longer remember why. Braddock's grave, marked by the 1913 monument on the knoll above the old roadbed, is preserved as part of Braddock Road Park in Fayette County, Pennsylvania. It marks a grave that was lost for 50 years and rediscovered by accident. In a wilderness that is no longer wilderness, on a road that no longer goes where it once went. Fort Duquesne was demolished by the retreating French in 1758. The point, where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers join to form the Ohio, is today preserved as Point State Park in downtown Pittsburgh. The river James Smith watched from the fort's walls on the night of July 10, 1755, still runs past the spot where he watched it. What remains, more than the objects, is the pattern. The pattern of an empire that mistook its own confidence for competence. The pattern of a doctrine so thoroughly internalized that its failure could not be perceived even as it was happening. The pattern of a young man on a horse, riding through a firestorm that killed everyone around him, who would carry that experience into a different war and use it to win. Edward Braddock has been remembered mostly as a cautionary tale. The rigid European general, undone by his contempt for the wilderness. The caricature is not entirely unfair, but it misses something. Braddock was a representative figure. The doctrines he applied at the Monongahela were standard. They were what every British general had been trained to do. What broke at the Monongahela was not Edward Braddock personally. What broke was a particular relationship between European military doctrine and the specific conditions of North American warfare. Braddock happened to be the man on the road when that relationship failed. The British Army that the Continental forces would face in 1775 had partially relearned how to conduct operations in American terrain. But it had not learned how to win a political war in a colonial society that had concluded, partly on the basis of what had happened to Braddock, that imperial authority was neither competent nor benevolent enough to deserve continued allegiance. The cost of contempt compounds. Braddock's contempt for the colonists and for the wilderness produced the disaster of 1755. The British government's continued contempt for colonial Americans in the decades that followed produced the political disaster of 1775 and the military disasters that followed. Hubris is not just a personal failing. It is a systemic pattern. This is what the Battle of the Monongahela ultimately teaches. Empires accumulate advantages over time. Disciplined troops, sophisticated weapons, established doctrines. These advantages produce victories. The victories produce confidence. The confidence becomes contempt. Contempt for the people who lack those advantages. Contempt for the conditions that might neutralize those advantages. Contempt for the lessons that experience tries to teach. And then the empire walks into a forest in full dress uniform, with colors flying and drums beating. And the forest swallows it. 977 men in 3 hours on a road 12 feet wide. The forest is still there. So is the road. So are the names. Halkett, Gage, Burton, St. Clair, Washington, Braddock, Beaujeu, Dumas, Contrecoeur, Red Hawk, Smith. Names from an afternoon in 1755, when an empire learned, briefly, what its contempt was worth, and then chose to forget what it had learned, and then paid for the forgetting 20 years later, when Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown to the descendants of the men who had survived the Monongahela. Braddock rode into the woods at the head of a column of 1,400 men, certain that the empire he served could not be defeated by what waited for him there. He was wrong about the empire, and he was wrong about what waited for him. Sometimes the most important defeats are the ones history forgets. The Monongahela was one of those defeats. It made the men who would unmake the empire that lost it. It buried a general beneath his own road. It taught a lesson the empire refused to learn, and that the empire's enemies absorbed and applied with patience that would mature 20 years later into independence. The forest swallowed Edward Braddock in July of 1755. The road he built, the road that carried him to his death and was used to bury him, runs through every imperial defeat that contempt for the conditions of one's enemies has ever produced. That is what the Monongahela means. The empire learned nothing. Its survivors learned everything. That, in the end, was the only difference.